Hey Sapiens, welcome back. This is the Epilogue to the Meaning of Life, and you didn't think I was done talking, did you? You think I don't have more to say? I have a ton to say. I could talk forever. There are a couple more things that I would like to cover, and of course, it's tough like this when these are things that I think about all the time, and I'm continually reading new works and trying to refine my thinking, and I'll probably produce updates, and at the same time, who knows, maybe every 5 years, 10 years, I'll rewrite the meaning of life and hopefully do it better and better. We'll see. But for all I said about the meaning of life, I did talk about some of the existentialist philosophers and sprinkled in, I was like, oh, Albert Camus and Paul Sartre and all these people. But I wanted to talk about it again a little more seriously, a little more clearly. And I gave a talk before at a philosophy club, which was Reframing Nihilism, Existentialism, and Absurdism in Information Theory. So I kind of tested these ideas. But I'm trying to combine the theory of information with existentialism and these other meaning-based philosophies. And it seemed to land very well with people. They were very interested. So, I want to share that, and I'll briefly discuss information theory, and then I'll get into how this applies to these specific philosophies. And so, okay, I'm going to flash an image on screen here. This is the information theory communication model. Information theory is the mathematical study of the quantification, storage, and communication of information. Information theory studies the transmission, processing, extraction, and utilization of information. Abstractly, information can be thought of as the resolution of uncertainty. So, yeah, you can see here in this model of communication, there's a sender and receiver, and there's a channel of communication that the information goes through, the style of communication. And then there's an encoding process from the sender and a decoding process from the receiver. And then there's feedback to clarify and remove uncertainty. There's a lot of many basic concepts that reappear in the different communication models. So like sender, receiver, message, channel, signal, encoding, decoding, noise, feedback, and context. But, a lot of these words mean what you probably think they mean. And so there's a lot of examples of this communication model applied. But yeah, basically, I'm trying to communicate with you. And so I'm trying to think of what I want to say and what I want you to understand. So I encode that in language, and then I speak out my sentence. So, I encode my message, I send my message through speech, it travels through the air, it reaches your ears, you're decoding the message, and then you're trying to receive that, and so understand what I say, and then you might ask me a question back, but not in this situation, you can leave your comments, but you would want to clarify and remove uncertainty what I said to ensure that you understood. And again, that's just like us talking, but there's all kinds of levels of this communication model applied, where we can talk about, communication in terms of I'm recording this video and the signals of light are being sent into my camera, and that is being encoded into a digital format where it's going to be uploaded and it's going to be decoded and then sent, and that message will be displayed on your screen. And so just all kinds of stuff. You can give tons and tons of examples, but in signal processing, a signal is a function that conveys information about a phenomenon. Any quantity that can vary over space or time can be used as a signal to share messages between observers. So there's a lot of little things I want to point out here, and I will over time, which is that, we're often talking about between observers. So again, now that you've seen most of my work, I hope, there's subjective selves here. And this is intersubjective. Communication is always intersubjective. So there was another interesting book that I listened to. It's called The Language Game. And I've thought about this a lot because we talked about human needs, right? And we talked about understanding as a fundamental human need. So they say language isn't about hardwired grammars, but about near total freedom. Something like a game of charades, with the only requirement being a desire to understand and be understood. That was really interesting to me. And they, of course, support that throughout their entire book. And they're two linguists, these two authors, and definitely recommend that book, The Language Game. Also, it kind of goes back to Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, who also said something similar. But it seems like language is less about this like perfect mathematical object, and it's really a game of charades that's been played by culture for thousands of years now, as long as we've had language. And I feel like for people who've played charades a lot with the same people, you realize that like certain things almost, certain physical expressions almost become a language, and you can communicate fast. And you can see how like sign language develops too. But again, we have the sender and we have the receiver. The sender wants to be understood, the receiver wants to understand. And if you have those two parts, then language will develop. The other interesting thing about language is that it really depends on the context of the problem. It seems like most often we have a problem that the sender and receiver are trying to solve. And within that grounding, we can make new words, we can advance, and things develop. But essentially there's a challenge as well that needs to be a challenge of cooperation or some sort that pushes us to develop a little bit more and expand our range. So that's information theory, but I also want to talk about, I guess we could get into the philosophies like pre-nihilism. And pre-nihilism is not like a philosophical technical term, it was just something, I'm saying before nihilism was invented, we can categorize people as largely believing this. And the quote here is, essence precedes existence. So your essence precedes when you were born. And you were born with meaning and purpose. Lots of people believe this, and that we are a part of God's plan with a beginning, middle, and end. God is the sender of all signals, and we are the receiver. So there are some background assumptions that people had when they used to believe in God, and that God was the creator of all things. So God is all good, and God wants us to understand signals from the external world. God is the conscious, intentional message sender behind signals. And God created our decoding process, which is accurate enough to fulfill our purpose. So it's those things that like, again, having that model of communication, we think that there are two observers here. We're the receiver, and God is the sender of signals. And God knew us before we were born, and God knew us in the womb. And again, it's like, why was the sun created? Well, God put it there to help us. And you kind of see that there's a background assumption and a context to how we interpret signals. And it's like when René Descartes was also talking about how we can trust our senses because we can trust that God is all good and purposely created us to be able to decode appropriately. So this was sort of the context before nihilism came about that is how we interpreted the environment in our world. So we had a lot of meaning there, so we thought. So then nihilism comes about, and nihilism, there are many different types of nihilism, but we're dealing with existential nihilism. The universe is devoid of meaning. And there's a breakdown of the previous communication assumptions that we just talked about. So if there's no God, then there's no intentional consciousness behind the messages. And we become distrustful of the entire process. So that was the kind of idea of nihilism. And of course, there was a historical context, and like we were losing faith in our institutions, our religions, and everything. And science was telling us a very different picture of the universe. But suddenly, if we really take the place of evolution, we don't know that the universe is sending us any intentional messages. So we're receiving signals, but it's almost like the light of the sun being reflected off the moon. See, we're getting signals, we are clarifying things in a certain way, but the moon itself is not an intentional observer who wants to be understood. And so that's the really tough part that breaks everything down. Of course, you have that quote where people say, the universe is under no obligation to be understood. So now there's this massive breakdown where meaning seems to come in this interplay between sender and receiver, and between the two groups converging on understanding, which they're both working towards. But now we're finding that our process could be totally one-sided. And it's a very disturbing breakdown, especially as you see that we go from pre-nihilism, where we feel like there's meaning behind everything and good intentions, to now it's like, we're talking to nothing. You're having a conversation with nothing. You're hearing echoes and strange signals that don't even want you to understand or don't care. So quite bleak when you get into it. But after that came Existentialism from Sartre. So a quote here is, existence precedes essence. So this was you could see a reversal of what we used to think before. We used to think we were all created with a divine purpose, that we were created by God and we had like a mission in life and an organizing principle. And Sartre had us realize and try to say, like, listen, we exist first, but afterwards we are able to define our own essence. So I think what Sartre is saying, based on this communication model, is the emphasis is placed on the decoding process, which creates meaning. So when we go out and live in the world and how we understand things, it's really about how we interpret the signals we're receiving. So we are trying to understand what's going on in the world, but most of our meaning is from that decoding process, how we piece signals together to find understanding. So in that sense, yeah, the meaning that we have is created by ourselves. And if we take charge of that and realize that that's what we're doing, then we're able to make meaning for ourselves. We choose how we decode. We choose how we interpret. But along came as well Absurdism. So this was also a reaction after Existentialism, and this was Albert Camus. But absurdity is exposed in our decoding, trying to make sense of a noisy universe. So we regularly run into computational reducibility, where we can find a pattern, versus computational irreducibility, where there's no pattern. I'll flash this on screen as well. As you can see, this is a process of cellular automata, and this is again from our prophet, Stephen Wolfram, but I believe this is Rule 30, is what it's called. There's a certain set of rules which create this triangle or pyramid that you see. Talking about computational reducibility versus irreducibility, on the left-hand side, you should see that it seems like there's a really consistent pattern on the left-hand side. And we could reduce this. It seems like we could predict, a different area of the shape, and you could say that things are going on well, but then you see like there's something really weird going on with the right-hand side, where things seem like they're ordered, but suddenly it goes on to the right-hand side and it's irreducible. There's no pattern to be found there. So we've talked before about the game of life and our universe and the physical states and laws, but it seems like our universe is irreducible in a certain sense overall, we find this clash. Here's the absurdity, is in our universe, there are pockets of reducibility. So this whole thing seems kind of random, right? And we don't find a pattern. On the left-hand side, you do see a pattern, but it quickly steps off into something that's chaotic. So it's like order versus chaos. And essentially with the communication model that we have, absurdism is when we had a previous pattern that we expected, but then we find that there's no pattern. So we thought something was reducible, and then we experience irreducibility. We thought something was ordered, and we experience disorder and chaos. And that clash is the absurdity of life. We think things have meaning. We think things make sense. But then we inevitably hit a barrier where things don't make sense the way we thought they did. And gosh, this is the cruelty of life. It's what's really difficult. So another view is, it's like ChatGPT. ChatGPT is a weird thing that we're getting more experience with, but some people have called it a stochastic parrot. So it's just a random parrot. And if you think of like a parrot that can talk, if you try to, if you're about to leave your house and you have a parrot and the parrot says, "Don't forget your keys." And then you're like, "Oh, thanks, parrot. You know, I shouldn't forget my keys." And you're trying to remind me. But then 10 minutes later when you're gone, it just says the same thing. "Don't forget your keys." You realize like the parrot doesn't totally understand the context of what you're doing and wasn't trying to remind you. But we made sense of that anyway, because we make sense of things. We try to understand them. And ChatGPT is also like, kind of like that random thing, you know? It's spitting out words and it seems coherent, but there isn't actually an intentional observer, so we think, behind ChatGPT trying to understand with you. It's just like a machine spitting out words randomly. And we make sense of that. And that's our decoding process. But what I'm getting at too is that the universe is kind of like that. The universe is sending out signals all the time by merely existing, and it's not trying to be understood. But it's human nature to try to understand. And that's what Camus is saying as well, is that we are meaning-driven creatures. And we're going to try to find meaning. It's the way that we're set up, just our self-organizing principles. As a self-organizing dissipative structure, the way we're made, we're meant to make meaning. And it's like listening to a conversation in your native language and not trying to understand the words that you hear. You can try that. It's really difficult. So just like that, even if the signals are random, we're going to be looking for meaning in those signals continually. And Camus thinks that we have 3 options given all these facts. So you could just kill yourself. He's like, you could just commit suicide. I'm like, this is pretty awful. You could just die. And that's one option. Then there's option 2, which is religion. So he calls this philosophical suicide, though, because you basically are dumbing yourself down. Basically, you're taking you've become like fully aware of the absurdity of life, but now you're like, you know what was better when we had pre-nihilism, when we believed in God, and now we think that the signals all make sense, that the universe is looking out for you. Like, we should just go back to that. So he's saying like that's something you could do, just believe in religion. But again, you're like denying reality. But hey, you cope and you get through. But the third option is really interesting, which is that you can embrace absurdity. And these are where the ideas of an absurdist hero comes in, because you basically just have to be fully aware and fully accept that this is the nature of life, that you will continually search for meaning, just as the nature of who you are. You have to accept that inevitably, most likely at some point, you're going to clash with reality hard as you realize any meaning that you make is just a mismatch with reality as it is. That's not how reality is, that's not how you're seeing it. And eventually the errors will basically cause you a paradigm shift. And it's gonna suck really bad. And you have to recreate yourself. You have to recreate your meaning. Yeah, overall, I think, we can talk about the philosophies in terms of this communication model and see that they both emphasize different things. So I think that like Camus in the information model is not just emphasizing the decoding process, but the inevitable clash with the feedback we get from the signals we receive of a random devoid universe. So it is kind of like accepting both existentialism and nihilism. But yeah, it's really tough, but I hope that was illuminating to apply this model to the philosophies of existentialism. And something else that came up when I gave this talk as well is there's also a Buddhist answer, which is to meaning, which is to not hold the question, which is an interesting perspective. So the Buddha says, basically, don't think about it. But I think if a question is like a receiver, and when you have a question, when you hold a question, you're waiting for an answer, you're searching for an answer, you're looking for it. But if you don't create a receiver with an open question, then there is no pain in being uncertain of an answer. Through meditation, perhaps you could drop the question so that you're not caught up in that search for meaning. This can be difficult to do if, as Absurdism says, we are doomed to search for meaning. But I do want to talk about these differences that I observe between Eastern versus Western views of meaning. And I think it's almost like that of the difference between peripheral versus focused vision. So in peripheral vision, we're taking in the whole as we see it. So the whole of what we see, not really focusing on any one thing. And it's almost like if you try to pay attention to the boundaries of your vision. In focused vision, we are looking sharply at a precise target and missing much else. And I think that's almost like in general, and don't get too weird with this, but I think that's the difference between Eastern and Western thought. I feel like Eastern thought, while they can focus and we can do peripheral and everything too, but they take in a lot more of the whole than what Westerners do, which is that we often go very precise and focused on one specific area. And we try to empirically reduce that and work that out and then move on. So it's a very different structure of mind, but in meditation, it takes us down to a peripheral view. If we try to expand our awareness and be aware of everything. And when we do that, we are swimming in meaning all the time. So there's meaning everywhere because there's meaning in signals constantly. Your hunger, your thirst, your urge to socialize, all of our needs and urges propel us forward in a search for feedback from the environment. So if you sit long enough, meaning will find you. That's living. Again, if you start to think about how much of your body is really just about sending and receiving signals. Hunger is a signal that your body needs energy. Thirst is a signal that your body needs water. And we're receiving a lot of signals from the environment as well. So it's just by living, we're faced with that existential problem to continue living and persist. And if you're going to survive, you have to answer these challenges, or you die and you stop living. But that is in some way, I think the meditator's answer to meaning is a necessity and is all around us and everything that we have to do to survive. But this is kind of different than the Western mindset, where I feel like it's focusing on the conclusion of a long argument. When we say the meaning of life is X, we run into problems of support for this conclusion. Because it's also really hard to convince other people of this because we can give them the premises, but there might be conflicting information. Like other people don't see the world that way. They don't have those values. And the conclusion could appear dissociated from life and living. Like it could be a really abstract principle. So, I mean, I think there's issues with that as well. It's really hard to communicate that to other people because, again, it's like this really long argument. But with all these philosophers and thinkers, I'm really curious what they would say about flow states, because we talked about flow states before as well. Because it's basically defined as intrinsically meaningful. So in flow states, we have the sending and receiving of signals. So we take drawing as an example. There is a feedback between the artist and their drawing. So they attempt to encode an image on paper, and the paper sends signals back to the artist on their accuracy in encoding. So there's an error message they're honing in on. If the artwork doesn't look like how they want it to look, they get that feedback, they erase it and try to encode again to reduce the uncertainty, the difference from what they have in mind versus what's on the paper. And once the focus of the task is established, like trying to produce an image in mind, each stroke and action falls into place with purpose. And again, it's that sender and receiver model where we do have an observer and we have something that they're working on, and it's any kind of flow state. But when you get this like feedback loop where you're sending a signal, you're interacting, and then you're getting feedback signals back, and there's an error message about how well or how far off you're doing, then there's something about that is intrinsically meaningful to the person. And you do see that, like, you know, if you were to most of the time pause a person and ask them about what action they're taking, they'll explain it within the context of the task that they've done. So, I mean, on an objective level, flow states are meaningful in and of themselves as information processing to an intelligent agent. So I don't think I would have found this answer as satisfying when I was younger. It feels like there's something missing. Like, how do we decide which flow activity to engage with? And I guess I want to get at too is that, like, there is some objective meaning, because if an intelligent agent runs this program of a flow state, then they will feel like their actions, their life has meaning, what they're doing has meaning. But I guess what's missing is it's almost like that pre-nihilism tug, where I feel like if you grew up with that pre-nihilism, essence precedes existence, then you want God or like this authority figure or this broader context to ground what you're doing. But as far as grounding, I feel like there isn't much of a greater grounding than the challenge of living and trying to survive. But there's also something else here, which is like, how do we ground ourselves in terms of how do we decide what to do? And here, studying AI did have a big impact on me. It gave me some insights where if we talk about decision policies and decision theory. So in AI, there's the study of decision theory, which is probability theory plus utility theory. So ideally, this combination leads to rational actions, what an agent should choose to do. And probability theory is just like the probability of data that we've seen and how the world works and all that good stuff, the state of the game and what will happen next. But utility theory is about desires and values. And so if we look at the flow state as discussed previously, so there's like a bunch of components, but like looking at the first three, it's knowing what to do, knowing how to do it, and knowing how well you are doing. So I think steps 1 and 3, knowing what to do and knowing how well you are doing, are really about utility theory as well. And these are values. Knowing how to do something is more like the probability state. But I'm like trying to analyze myself too, but essentially I think I've really struggled with this due to early childhood trauma. I've also had late childhood trauma and adult trauma, a lot of varieties of trauma. I mean, I'm up to here with trauma right now, unfortunately. But yeah, I just think my utility theory got a little screwed up. So I think that our parents and caregivers play an important psychological role in shaping our internal utility theory, which shapes our decision policies for actions. Key components of the flow state for living were empty for me, and much of my work has been a long search for objective values I feel safe and assured in trusting. You know, it's like, what do I want the meaning of life to do for me? Why do I search for it? And I've always felt that, like, if I have more of a sense of meaning in my life and what the meaning of life really is, then it'll tell me what I value. Well, it'll tell me how to understand my past and how to predict myself in the future. And essentially, it's like knowing what to do and knowing how well you are doing. And gosh, I have to say, it's also a weird experience to realize that your whole personality is like based around trauma, basically a trauma reaction. There's something called the neuroaffective relational model. It's called NARM. It identifies 5 survival styles based on the time of trauma in development. So basically, like building up, the first survival style is connection to self, to your body, to others. And that's like, you know, maybe up to 6 months of age and stuff like that. And afterwards, we learn attunement to our own needs, so what our body needs. Then we develop trust, and then we develop autonomy, so sense of freedom. And by around the age of 5, we're getting a sense of love and sexuality. You know, depending on when you had trauma, I guess like these survival styles, like everyone has all of these. And if you're not traumatized during those ages and like you developed well, then like you have a, you know, secure, stable attachment, then it's not usually like not so traumatic. But some people, they get rocked by life really hard on some of these levels. And there are subtypes to each survival style. But at the connection level, there's a spiritual and logical subtype, and both types search for meaning. The spiritual subtypes, they're looking for meaning in terms of like, you know, astrology and all the tarot cards and stuff. And if you think about it, they are kind of looking for this like sense of purpose and drivenness. And I think meaning is about understanding and value. Meaning is a story we tell ourselves. Understanding is explanation and prediction. How we understand our past to predict ourselves into the future. So I think meaning is like a glue or structure formed in our minds that enables us to find a state of flow. So I really wonder, is it like, whoa, like, are neurotypical people with secure attachment, are they in a flow with life? Like, are they just like, boom, getting it, like really interacting and in a way that I don't quite understand? But yeah, what I want from the meaning of life is to understand myself, my place, and my direction. And with meaning, I feel I can move forward. And for the most part, I believe I found it with a strong objective base. You know, I wanted something resilient and robust. And yeah, I kind of found that for myself, for the most part. But all this to say, thank you for joining me on my journey. And it's time for me to live life in a more present way. It's likely you have some trauma, like me, and meaning. If meaning is such a serious concern for you, like it is for me, and you made it this far. But, you know, I hope this has helped you and you can build from it. And I hope you can heal if you have some pretty serious trauma too. But as a final farewell, may you be happy, may you be free from suffering. Thanks.